The stairs are free, Silas. Gravity doesn't charge a convenience fee. Bianca Castellano didn't even look up from her gold-trimmed ledger as she leaned against the peeling wallpaper of the lobby. She looked like a thoroughbred trapped in a glue factory. Her white silk blouse was worth more than the building's annual property tax, and her expression suggested that even the air Silas breathed was an insult to her lungs. 13 floors, Silas said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of controlled fury. He dropped a heavy bag of hardware disguised in a generic plastic sack onto the cracked linoleum. It hit with a metallic thud. The lift has been dead for 3 days. My neighbor in 12B is 80 years old. She's trapped up there. Bianca finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes were sharp, dark, and utterly devoid of empathy. Then I suggest you carry her down on your back. It'll be the first useful thing you've done since you moved into my building and started dragging down the property value. With that disaster-chic wardrobe of yours? Silas took a step into her personal space. He was a head taller, his frame honed by a decade of rowing and a year of manual labor. He'd taken on just to stay invisible. Most men would have flinched. Bianca didn't even blink. The lease guarantees a functional building, Bianca. Fix the lift or I withhold the rent. A jagged, mocking laugh escaped her throat. She stepped closer, the scent of expensive jasmine clashing violently with the smell of wet basement. She reached out, her manicured thumb and forefinger pinching the sleeve of his faded gray hoodie as if she were handling a biohazard. Withhold it, she whispered, her voice a poisonous caress. Please, give me the legal excuse to toss your depressing little life onto the sidewalk. I'm turning this dump into a boutique hotel, and you, Silas, are the mold I'm about to scrub off the walls. You're not a tenant. You're an occupant of a space you don't deserve. Now get out of my way. I have a dinner at the club, and I've already spent too much time breathing the same oxygen as a man who smells like a radiator leak. She brushed past him, her shoulder hitting his with a deliberate, sharp force. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors to her waiting Mercedes, she tossed one last line over her shoulder. Take the stairs? Silas, maybe the lack of oxygen at the top will help you hallucinate. A life where you actually matter. Silas stood in the flickering light of the lobby, watching the red taillights of her car disappear into the rain. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone, a device that cost more than Bianca's car. He didn't call a repairman. He dialed a direct line to the Cayman Islands. It's Vesper, he said, his voice devoid of the sigh persona he'd worn for months. The Castellano family debt. Buy it, all of it. The predatory loans, the bridge financing, the mortgage on their villa. I want the papers on my desk by 8 o'clock. He looked at the broken elevator doors, a cold, predatory smile spreading across his face. And find out who her florist is, Silas added, his eyes darkening. I want to know exactly what kind of lilies to send to her. Company's funeral tomorrow. Morning. The glass and steel monolith of Apex. Plaza pierced the morning fog like a jagged needle. Bianca Castellano stood in the lobby, smoothing the invisible wrinkles in her power suit. She felt sick. Behind the designer sunglasses and the $5,000 handbag, her world was hemorrhaging. Her father's hands had been shaking this morning. The creditors weren't just calling anymore. They were hovering like vultures over the Castellano name. I'm here to see the chairman, she told the receptionist. Her voice regained its practiced, aristocratic edge. I have a 9:30 regarding the Sterling Castellano debt restructuring. The receptionist didn't even ask for her name. She simply gestured toward the private express elevator. The chairman is expecting you, Ms. Castellano, floor 66. As the elevator blurred upward, Bianca caught her reflection in the polished brass. She looked perfect. She looked like money. She looked like someone who hadn't spent the previous evening mocking a peasant in a basement apartment. She needed this loan. Without Apex's capital, her family would be on the street by the end of the month. The doors slid open to a room of obsidian and silence. The office was vast, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city she used to own. At the far end, a massive desk of petrified wood sat empty. The high-backed leather chair turned toward the window, showing only a glimpse of a dark suit jacket and the crown of a man's head. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Bianca said, her heels clicking across the marble. She didn't wait for him to turn. She needed to lead. I'll be brief. Castellano. Holdings is looking for a strategic partner to consolidate our urban portfolio. We have assets in the Iron District that are primed for... The Iron District? The voice was a low, resonant baritone. It was familiar. Too familiar. It sent a cold shiver down Bianca's spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. You mean the slums? Where the elevators don't work and the landlords tell the tenants to sleep under bridges? Bianca froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. I beg your pardon? The chair swiveled. The man sitting there wasn't wearing a faded charcoal hoodie. He was draped in a bespoke midnight blue three-piece suit. His hair was slicked back, revealing the sharp, predatory bone structure of a Roman general. His eyes, the ones she had called depressing just 12 hours ago, were now 2 chips of frozen flint. Silas Vesper leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Between his long, elegant fingers, He held a familiar piece of paper, the repair request for Unit 12. The radiator is still leaking, Bianca, Silas said, his voice a silky caress of pure malice. And the stairs? You were right. They are quite the workout. I had a lot of time to think between the 8th and ninth floors this morning. Bianca's bag slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The sigh from the basement, the man she treated like a cockroach, was the most feared. Corporate raider in the hemisphere. You, she breathed, the color draining from her face until she matched her white blouse. How? Why? Why? Silas stood up, his presence filling the room, suffocating her. He walked around the desk with the slow, deliberate grace of a wolf. Because for a year I wanted to see the world from the bottom. I wanted to see who people are when they think no one is watching. And I saw you, Bianca. He stopped inches from her, exactly where she had stood in the lobby the night before. This time he was the one looking down. I didn't just buy your debt this morning, Silas whispered, leaning in until she could smell the expensive sandalwood and the scent of her own mounting terror. I bought the bank that held it. I bought your father's outstanding markers. And 20 minutes ago I signed the deed to Villa Castellano. He reached out, his thumb grazing the gold earring she wore, a family heirloom. You told me to find a bench in the park, remember? He smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. Pack your bags, Bianca. My movers will be at the villa at noon. But don't worry, I'm not a monster. I have decided to let you stay. Bianca found her voice, though it was thin and trembling. Stay? On what terms? Silas walked to the window, looking out at the city he now dominated. The same ones you gave me. You'll live in the servants' quarters. You'll handle the maintenance. And since you love the cardiovascular benefits of the stairs so much, I've decided the villa's elevator is officially out of order. He turned back to her, his eyes burning with a dark, triumphant fire. Consider this your first month's rent. Ms. Castellano, don't be late with the coffee. I like it black. Just like your heart. The iron gates of Villa Castellano didn't groan when they opened. They purred. Silas watched from the back of his darkened sedan as the sensors recognized his newly registered biometric signature. The estate was a sprawling masterpiece of neoclassical architecture, a fortress of ivory stone and manicured hedges that had belonged to the Castellanos for 4 generations. Now it was just another line item on Silas's balance sheet. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the white gravel. Bianca was already there, standing by the massive oak front doors. She wasn't wearing the power suit anymore. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in a tight, severe knot. She looked less like a queen and more like a ghost haunting her own hallways. Beside her sat 2 small suitcases. The rest of her life, the designer gowns, the family portraits, the heirlooms had been locked in the attic per Silas's orders. You're late, she said. The fire hadn't quite died in her eyes, but it was flickering. I had to sign the papers to demolish the foundry, Silas lied, watching for her flinch. Nasty place. Bad memories. The landlord was a real piece of work. Bianca flinched. Is that what this is? A very expensive exercise and I told you so? This is an audit, Bianca. Silas stepped past her, entering the grand foyer. The marble floors were cold, polished to a mirror finish. I want to see if you're as good at maintaining a home as you are at destroying one. He tossed his keys onto a silver tray. They clattered with a sound like a guillotine blade. The master suite is off limits to you, he continued, walking toward the grand staircase. You'll be staying in the basement quarters, near the boiler. I'm told the pipes have a rhythmic knocking sound, very industrial. I thought you'd appreciate the aesthetic. The basement is for storage, Silas. It's damp. So was Unit 12, he countered, spinning around to face her. His voice was suddenly sharp, stripped of its playfulness. I spent 12 months breathing in black mold and listening to you tell me it was character. Now, you're going to get a lot of character, Bianca. Starting with the guest list for tonight. By midnight, the villa was silent, save for the hum of the cooling system. Silas wasn't in the master suite. He was in the library, his coat off, his sleeves rolled up. He wasn't looking at the wine cellar or the art. He was looking at the floorboards. He moved a heavy Persian rug, revealing a faint seam in the wood. He took a small electronic device from his pocket, the same one he'd used in the slum basement, and ran it over the floor. Beep, beep, beep. He pried open the hidden panel. Inside wasn't gold or jewelry. It was a stack of ledger books bound in rotting leather, stamped with a symbol he recognized instantly, a compass and a plumb bob. The architects, searching for the family silver? Silas didn't jump. He turned slowly to see Bianca standing in the doorway, a flickering candle in her hand. The power in the basement had mysteriously failed an hour ago, just as he knew it would. This symbol, Silas said, pointing to the ledger. Your father wasn't just losing money at the track. He was paying dues. Bianca walked into the room, the candlelight casting long, jagged shadows against the rows of books. She didn't look angry. She looked exhausted. He wasn't paying dues, Silas, she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. He was paying ransom. Why do you think I was so desperate for your rent? Why do you think I was trying to flip that building into a hotel? She stepped closer, the light illuminating the dark circles under her eyes. I didn't ignore your repairs because I was cruel. I ignored them because every cent I made it went to a blind account to keep my father alive. I needed you to leave so I could sell the land and buy his freedom. Silas stood up, the ledger in his hand feeling suddenly heavy. You're lying. You're a Castellano. You thrive on leverage. Look at the dates, Silas, she snapped, a tear finally breaking loose. The payment started the same month you were ousted from Apex. They weren't just targeting us. They were using us to get to you. Silas opened the book. His eyes scanned the columns of numbers, his mind working at overclocked speeds. His blood turned to ice. The accounts weren't being managed by a rival firm or a bank. The signatures at the bottom of the ransom receipts weren't from a stranger. They were in his own father's handwriting. The man who had supposedly died in a plane crash 5 years ago. The revenge story just hit a structural failure. Silas hadn't been the hunter. He had been the bait. And Bianca? She wasn't his enemy. She was his cellmate. The morning sun hit the marble. Floors of Villa Castellano with a brilliance that felt like a mockery. Silas sat at the head of the 20-foot mahogany dining table, a single cup of black coffee in front of him. He wasn't looking at the breakfast spread. He was staring at the ledger from the night before. The revelation that his father was alive and acting as a parasitic shadow over the city's elite had turned his cold revenge into a feverish need for answers. The swinging door to the kitchen creaked. Bianca entered carrying a silver tray. She had swapped the black dress for a crisp, button-down shirt, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. There was a smudge of soot on her cheek, likely from trying to coax the ancient basement boiler into life. Your coffee, she said, setting a fresh pot down with a sharp clink. And the morning papers. I took the liberty of circling the bankruptcy filing for Sterling Properties. I assume that was the dessert you were waiting for? Silas didn't look up. Sit down, Bianca. I have floors to wax, Silas, according to your tenant agreement. The foyer needs to be reflective enough for you to shave in. Sit down. She pulled out the heavy chair opposite him, her movement stiff. The silence between them wasn't the jagged, hateful air of the previous day. It was heavy like the atmosphere before a tectonic shift. Last night, Silas began, finally closing the ledger. You said they were using you to get to me. Explain. Bianca leaned back, her gaze fixed on the family crest carved into the ceiling. My father was a gambler, yes, but not with money. He gambled with information. 5 years ago, he found out your father's death was a staged liquidity event. Your father didn't die. He divested. He moved his entire net worth into the shadows to form the architects. She looked at Silas, her eyes shimmering with a mix of pity and resentment. They squeezed us because we knew. They told my father that if he ever breathed, a word to you if he ever gave you, the proof you needed to reclaim the Vesper estate, they would level our holdings and leave us in the gutter. I wasn't just a cruel landlord, Silas. I was a warden. I was trying to keep my father alive by playing the role of the heartless heiress. Silas stood up, walking to the window that looked out over the sprawling gardens. Below the grass, deep in the bedrock, lay the secret he had discovered while living in her slum. The Iron District, Silas murmured. The basement I rented. It wasn't just a random apartment. I know, Bianca said, her voice hollow. It's the nexus point. The old arteries, all the physical messages between the city's secret societies passed through the pneumatic hubs under that building. You weren't hiding there, Silas. You were wiretapping the elite. Silas turned, his expression unreadable. And you let me stay. You could have turned me over to them. Why didn't you? Because, she said, standing up and walking toward him until she was close enough to see the silver flecks in his eyes. I wanted you to win. I figured if the great Silas Vesper was desperate enough to live in a hole with no heat, he was eventually going to get angry enough to burn the whole system down. I just didn't realize I'd be the first person you'd set fire to. The moment was interrupted by the chime of the front door, a heavy, rhythmic pounding that didn't sound like a guest. Silas moved to the security monitor. 2 men in charcoal suits stood at the gate. They weren't process servers. They were inspectors from the city's building department. Men Silas knew were on his father's payroll. They're here for the audit, Silas whispered. They know I have the ledgers. He turned to Bianca. The power dynamic shifted in a heartbeat. He wasn't the landlord and she wasn't the servant. They were 2 people in a sinking ship, and the only way out was to play a much more dangerous game. They think we're enemies, Silas said, grabbing her hand. Her skin was cold, but she didn't pull away. We need to give them a reason to believe we've formed a different kind of alliance. If they think I've broken you, they'll report back that I'm still under control. And how do we do that? Silas pulled her flush against him, his hand sliding to the back of her neck. We give them a show. We're going to announce our engagement tonight. A merger of the Vesper and Castellano bloodlines. It's the only way to get close enough to my father to put a knife in his empire. Bianca's breath hitched. You want to marry the woman you just evicted? I want to ruin the man who thinks he owns us both, Silas corrected. Think of it as a new lease, Bianca. Very long term. Very high stakes. The old arteries did not appear on any modern map of the city. Silas stood in the sub-basement of the very building where he had spent a year as a ghost. Beside him, Bianca held a high-powered industrial flashlight, its beam cutting through a decade of dust and damp. They weren't at the villa anymore. They had slipped out through a service entrance to return to the scene of his poverty. "You lived above this for 12 months, Bianca whispered, her voice echoing off the vaulted brickwork. "Did you ever sleep? Or did you just listen to the city's secrets breathing beneath your floorboards?" "I listened," Silas said, stepping toward a massive iron hub where dozens of brass tubes converged. He ran his hand over the brass. This was the central exchange for the architects. In an age of digital surveillance, the truly powerful had reverted to the physical. Handwritten memos, blueprints, and ledgers were sucked through these tubes at 60 miles per hour, hidden from every satellite and hacker in the world. "This is how they coordinated your eviction," Silas murmured. "And how they coordinated my father's death? Every order to squeeze the Castellanos passed through this junction." He pulled a small, high-tech device from his pocket, a digital interceptor. He began to clamp it onto the primary data line that ran parallel to the tubes. "If we're going to announce this engagement tonight," Silas said, his eyes fixed on his work, "I need to be able to see their reaction in real time. I need to know who calls my father the moment the news breaks." "You're using me as bait," Bianca said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a cold statement of fact. "We are both bait, Bianca, but a trapped animal is only dangerous when its hunter thinks the cage is locked." He turned to her, the flashlight's glow hitting the sharp angles of his face. "Are you ready to play the part of the conquered bride?" 4 hours later, the grand ballroom of the Apex Plaza was a sea of black ties and silk gowns. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the hushed whispers of the city's elite. Bianca stood at the top of the marble staircase, her hand resting on Silas's arm. She was wearing a gown of midnight velvet, a diamond choker at her throat that felt like a gilded leash. Silas looked every bit the victor, possessive, cold, and untouchable. "Smile, Bianca," he murmured into her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "Look like you've traded your soul for your family's safety. They need to believe I've broken you." As they descended, the room went silent. The ice queen of real estate, now arm in arm with the man who had systematically dismantled her empire. It was the ultimate corporate conquest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Silas's voice rang out, commanding the attention of every predator in the room. "Tonight is not just about the merger of Vesper Industries and Castellano Holdings. It is about a permanent alliance. It gives me great pleasure to announce my engagement to Bianca Castalano." A ripple of shock went through the crowd, followed by polite, hesitant applause. But Silas wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at his phone hidden in the palm of his hand. The interceptor in the old arteries was screaming. "We have a hit," Silas whispered to Bianca as he led her toward the dance floor. 3 calls were made the moment I spoke. 1 to a private cell in Switzerland, 1 to the governor's office, and 1... He stopped, his grip on her waist tightening. "And 1 to the villa?" Bianca finished, her heart skipping a beat. "No," Silas said, his eyes darkening as he looked toward the back of the ballroom. 1 to the person standing 10 feet behind you." Bianca turned slowly. Standing by the champagne fountain was her own father, Lorenzo Castellano. He didn't look like a broken man anymore. He looked polished, healthy, and was currently shaking hands with a man whose face was obscured by the shadows of the pillar. Silas realized in that moment that Lorenzo wasn't the victim. He hadn't been paying ransom to keep his life. He had been paying investment capital to help Silas's father build the data fortress. The Ice Queen had been kept in the dark by her own father, and Silas had just handed the keys to his empire to the very man who helped destroy his life. "Silas," Bianca whispered, seeing the look on his face. "What is it?" "Your father isn't the prisoner," Silas said, his voice a low, lethal snarl. "He's the warden, and we just walked right into his office." The music didn't stop, but to Silas, the violins suddenly sounded like a funeral dirge. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He watched as Lorenzo Castellano, the man who had supposedly been trembling in his study just days ago, leaned in and shared a whispered laugh with the shadow behind the pillar. Lorenzo caught Silas's gaze across the ballroom and raised a crystal flute of champagne. It wasn't a greeting. It was a toast to a successful trap. "Silas, you're hurting me," Bianca whispered. He realized he was crushing her hand. He forced his fingers to loosen, but his mind was already 3 moves ahead, recalculating the entire board. "Don't look at your father," Silas said, his voice a razor-thin command. "Look at me. Laugh. Act like I just told you a joke about our honeymoon. We are being watched by more than just socialites." "What did you see on the phone?" she asked, her smile bright and brittle as glass. "Your father isn't the victim, Bianca. He's a partner. Those payments you found in the ledger? They weren't ransom. They were buy-ins. He's been helping my father build the old arteries into a digital cage. And tonight, we just gave them the one thing they lacked, public legitimacy." Bianca's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "My father. He couldn't. He's a coward, Silas, but he isn't a monster. Cowards are the most dangerous monsters of all, Silas retorted. They'll burn the world just to stay warm. As they reached the edge of the dance floor, Lorenzo detached himself from the shadows and began walking toward them. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. He looked revitalized. His gait steady, the broken man replaced by a shark in a tuxedo. Silas, my boy, Lorenzo boomed, his voice carrying just enough to ensure the nearby board members heard him. A magnificent announcement. A bit unconventional given the history of your tenancy, but the Castellanos have always appreciated a man with a sense of irony. Lorenzo reached out to clap Silas on the shoulder. Silas didn't flinch, but his eyes were like liquid nitrogen. I learned from the best, Lorenzo, Silas said. I spent a year living in your basement. You'd be surprised how much you can learn about a man by the way he treats his garbage. Lorenzo's eyes twinkled with a malicious light. And now you own the villa, a beautiful circle. But remember, Silas, a house is only as strong as its foundation. And sometimes the foundation is built on things that are better left buried. He turned to his daughter, his expression softening into a mask of fatherly pride that made Silas want to retch. Bianca, darling, you look stunning. I trust Silas is treating his new acquisition with the respect she deserves. I'm learning my place, father, Bianca said, her voice dripping with a sarcasm so thick only Silas could hear the heartbeat of terror behind it. Good, good, Lorenzo leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that hit Silas's phone, interceptor like a thunderclap. The chairman is waiting for you. Both in the Obsidian Suite. He'd like to offer his personal congratulations. Silas felt Bianca's arm tremble against his. The chairman was the title his father used in the Architects. They weren't being invited to a meeting. They were being summoned to a sentencing. We wouldn't miss it, Silas said. As Lorenzo walked away, Silas leaned into Bianca's ear. The car is waiting at the side entrance. We have exactly 4 minutes before the security detail. Realizes we aren't going to the suite. We're not going back to the villa, Bianca. Where are we going? Silas looked toward the exit, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the Iron District. Back to the basement. If they want to play architect, we're going to show them what happens when you try to renovate a building while the tenant is still inside. The black Mercedes-Benz S-Class tore through the rain-slicked streets of the Iron District, its tires screaming against the cobblestones. Silas drove with a cold, mechanical precision, his eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the GPS. Behind them, 2 SUVs with tinted windows held a steady, aggressive distance, the architect's cleanup crew. They're gaining, Bianca said, her hand white-knuckled on the door handle. He knows it exists, Silas said, swerving hard to avoid a delivery truck. He doesn't know I've rewired the failsafe. In their world, power is top-down. They think if they control the chairman, they control the grid. They forgot about the man in the basement. He slammed the car into park an alleyway away from the foundry. They didn't use the front door. Silas kicked in the rotted plywood covering a coal chute, sliding into the darkness. Bianca followed without a second of hesitation, her silk heels snapping off as she hit the concrete floor of the cellar. They reached the central hub, the brass lungs of the city's secret communications. Hold the light, Silas commanded. He didn't go for the data lines this time. He went for the pneumatic pressure valves. He pulled a heavy wrench from a hidden cache behind a loose brick. You're going to blow the tubes? Bianca asked, the realization dawning on her. That will destroy every physical record they have moving through the city. All the blackmail, all the deeds, all the contracts. Not just destroy them, Silas muttered, his muscles straining as he torched a seal. I'm reversing the flow. The architects use a vacuum system. I'm turning it into a localized explosion. Every piece of evidence they're currently sending to my father's suite is about to be vomited out of the vents. In the Apex boardroom. Suddenly the lights in the basement flickered and died. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the floor above. Thump, thump, thump. The lift, Bianca whispered. Someone fix the lift. Silas froze. The elevator he had complained about for a year, the one Bianca had mocked him over, was descending. But it wasn't the cleanup crew. The elevator doors groaned open to reveal a man who looked exactly like Silas, but 30 years older, his face a map of refined cruelty. Arthur Vesper. You always did have a flair for the mechanical. Silas, his father said, stepping out into the grime of the basement. He didn't look at the pipes. He looked at his son with a terrifying kind of pride. But you missed the most important lesson of architecture. It's not about the walls. It's about the soil. Arthur held up a remote detonator. You think you're trapping me? Silas, I've been waiting for you to come back here. This building isn't just a hub. It's the load-bearing pillar for the entire Castellano portfolio. If this basement goes, every building Bianca owns, every skyscraper, every apartment, the villa itself, collapses legally and financially into a shell company. I controlled before you were even born. Silas felt the ground shift beneath him. He looked at Bianca. She wasn't looking at Arthur. She was looking at a small red light blinking on the elevator control panel. The soil, she whispered, her voice suddenly calm. You're right, Arthur. But you forgot one thing about the Castellanos. We don't just own the buildings. We own the water rights. Bianca grabbed the wrench from Silas's hand and didn't hit a pipe. She hit the main flood valve for the district's old canal system, hidden behind the elevator shaft. The final reversal, the basement didn't explode. It began to flood. Silas, now, she screamed. Silas realized her plan. The water wouldn't just drown the hub. It would short-circuit the entire digital grid Arthur had built. As the freezing water rushed in, Silas tackled his father into the rising pool, grabbing the detonator and crushing it under his boot. "The lease is up, Dad," Silas spat, the water rising to their waists. "And I'm keeping the security deposit." The water was a black, freezing tide, smelling of rust and a century of city filth. It rushed into the sub-basement with a roar, turning the old arteries into an underwater tomb. Arthur Vesper gasped as the cold hit his chest, his polished veneer finally cracking. He clawed at Silas's damp suit, but Silas was a statue of ice. He held his father against the vibrating brass of the hub as the short-circuiting wires overhead hissed and spat blue sparks like dying stars. "You'll drown us both," Arthur choked out, his eyes wide with the realization that his son wasn't bluffing. "The Castellano fortune, the Vesper legacy, it all goes underwater." "I've lived in the dark for a year." "Arthur!" Silas shouted over the roar of the rushing canal. "I got used to the cold." "Did you?" Bianca was already halfway up the emergency ladder, her ruined velvet gown heavy with water. She looked down, her face illuminated by the strobing electrical fires. "Silas, the pressure is peaking. If the hub blows while you're holding him, you're dead." Silas looked at his father, the man who had played God with their lives, who had turned Bianca into a servant and Silas into a ghost. With a roar of primal catharsis, Silas didn't strike him. He did something worse. He shoved his father toward the open elevator car and slammed the manual emergency lock. "The lift is working now, Dad," Silas growled, his voice echoing in the flooding chamber. "But it only goes to one floor." He punched the button for the lobby. As the elevator car rose, the sub-basement groaned. Silas scrambled up the ladder, his fingers slipping on the wet rungs, until he felt Bianca's hand lock around his wrist. She pulled him up with a strength born of pure desperation, hauling him onto the ground floor just as a muffled explosion rocked the foundation. 3 days later, the rain had stopped, leaving the city air scrubbed clean and unnaturally bright. Silas stood on the balcony of the Villa Castellano. He wasn't wearing a hoodie and he wasn't wearing a bespoke suit. He wore a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up, watching the sunrise. Below, the news crews were still gathered. At the Apex Plaza, the great flood of the Iron District had triggered a digital collapse that revealed every secret ledger, every bribe, and every blackmail file held by the architects. Arthur Vesper and Lorenzo Castellano were currently in federal custody, their architecture dismantled by the very water rights Bianca had weaponized. The glass door behind him slid open. Bianca stepped out carrying 2 cups of coffee. She looked at the horizon, her expression unreadable. "The engineers say the villa's foundation is intact," she said quietly, handing him a cup. "But the basement?" "We're going to have to fill it with concrete. I never want to go down there again." Silas took a sip. It was black. It was perfect. "And the tenants in the Iron District?" "Every one of them has been issued a lifetime lease at the original rate," Bianca said, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. "I've turned the management over to a nonprofit. I think I'm done being a landlord, Silas." Silas turned to her. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of the things they hadn't yet said. The revenge was over. The debt was settled. But the engagement they had faked was still the lead story in every paper in the country. "Your suitcases are still in the butler's quarters," Silas noted, his voice dropping an octave. "I know. And the master suite is still technically mine." Bianca set her coffee down on the stone railing and stepped into his space, her eyes defiant. "I don't recall seeing a signed lease for that, Mr. Vesper, and as the former owner, I'm very particular about who I let occupy my space." Silas reached out, his hand trailing the line of her jaw, his thumb lingering on the pulse point at her neck. "I'm a very demanding tenant, Bianca. I don't plan on moving out, ever." "Then you'd better be prepared to handle the maintenance," she whispered, leaning into him. "Because this time, if something breaks, I'm not fixing it for you." Silas laughed, a low, warm sound that finally chased the chill of the basement away. He pulled her into a kiss that tasted like coffee in the future, a foundation built not on secrets or revenge, but on the wreckage of the world they had burned down together. "The structural integrity," Silas murmured against her lips, "looks perfect to me."